Hey guys, tonight you wake up in a room with no windows. There's a woman counting coins, and you're one of them. We'll get to why your worth is measured in silver. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights and settle in. You're somewhere between 12 and 15 in the Han Dynasty capital, Chang'an. The exact year doesn't matter, because your story repeats across centuries. Your family made a choice between starvation and selling you. They chose to eat. You don't blame them. Hunger makes every choice simple. The cart ride to the palace takes 3 days. You're packed with other girls, all silent. The one next to you has expensive shoes. Her family wasn't poor. They were political enemies. The one across from you keeps her arms wrapped around her stomach, probably wondering if she's pregnant. Won't matter soon. Where you're going, that's not possible. The palace is bigger than your entire village. Red walls that seem to touch the clouds. You've never seen buildings this tall. Never imagined this many people could exist in one place. There are thousands of women here. You'll learn that most of them are like what you're about to become. They separate you by appearance and age. You learn quickly that being pretty is not lucky here. Pretty means closer to power. Closer to power means more dangerous. You're pretty enough to be noticed, plain enough to maybe survive. It's a balance you'll maintain for whatever years you have left. The examination room smells like metal and vinegar. The woman examining you doesn't look at your face. She checks your teeth, your skin, your development. Writes something on a wooden tablet. You can't read, but you'll later learn it says suitable for complete modification. You don't know what that means yet. What happens next? History records in medical texts, but will leave in shadow. There's a procedure. It changes everything about how your body works. Some accounts say 4 in 10 don't survive it. Others claim the death rate was lower. You survive, though survival might not be the right word. Continuing is more accurate. The recovery takes months. Every day they check the healing, adjust things, make sure you're forming the right kind of scar tissue. The pain is constant, but eventually becomes background noise. Your body adapts because bodies are obscenely good at adapting to horror. You're given a new name. Not really a name, more like a designation. Number 847 of the third quarter acquisitions. Your old name belonged to someone who could return home. That person doesn't exist anymore. You'll answer to your number for the rest of your life. The quarters they assign you are in the servants section. 7 other women share the space. You all move the same way now. Careful, controlled, managing bodies that don't work like they used to. Privacy doesn't exist. Everyone knows everyone else's struggles. There's no point in shame when shame is all you have. In the corner of your quarters lives a fat rat. He's been here longer than any of you. Stealing grain, watching everything, judging nothing. You name him Wei because that's what your little brother called the mouse in your family's grain storage. Wei doesn't care what you are now. To him, you're just another large thing that drops food sometimes. Your first assignment is laundry. The imperial family changes clothes multiple times daily. Silk robes that must be washed by hand. The lye burns your hands, cracks the skin until it bleeds. You're beaten when blood stains the silk. Not severely. Your property and damage reduces value, but enough to remind you what you are. The other workers range from girls your age to women who look ancient, but might only be 30. Suffering ages you fast here. They teach you through example, not words. Where to find clean water. How to manage your body's new requirements. Which supervisors hit and which just yell. Survival knowledge passed in glances and gestures. The work is endless. Dawn to after dark, washing silk that costs more than your family saw in a lifetime. Your own clothes are rough hemp, washed once a week if you're lucky. The contrast is so obvious it stops being ironic. Just another fact of palace life. Winter is the worst season. Everything hurts more in cold. Movement becomes harder. The washing water freezes your cracked hands. You learn to work through numbness, through pain that makes you want to scream. But you don't, because screaming brings attention, and attention is never good. Spring brings different problems. Humidity and warmth mean infections spread faster. The quarters smell worse. Everyone gets sick. But spring also means slightly better food, occasional vegetables in the servant porridge. You learn to be grateful for small improvements. The hierarchy among workers is complex. Those who underwent different levels of modification don't mix much. According to some historical sources, though these are debated, there were three main categories: complete modification, partial, and simple sterilization. Everyone protecting whatever dignity remains by finding someone worse off. You're not at the bottom, but close enough to see it clearly. Let's talk about the economics, because the palace was, above all, an economic machine. According to palace records that survive, though historians debate their accuracy, a girl like you cost 5 taels of silver to purchase. The procedure cost another 12. Your expected working life was 15 to 20 years. The return on investment was calculated at roughly 200 taels of labor value. The palace accountants had formulas for everything. Cost of purchase plus modification divided by expected years of service equals annual value. They could tell you exactly what a female eunuch was worth per year, per month, per day. Human suffering converted to mathematical precision, though these numbers come from limited sources and might not represent the full picture. Some sources suggest there were 3,000 female eunuchs in the Han Palace. Others say 10,000 across the empire. The Tang Dynasty records claim 5,000 in the capital alone. The real number is unknowable because you weren't considered worth documenting individually. You existed as aggregate labor, recorded like brooms or buckets. The traders who supplied girls to palaces were businessmen with established roots. According to fragmentary commercial records, they knew which villages were desperate enough to sell daughters, which local officials could be bribed, which routes avoided inspectors. Some traders specialized: pretty girls from Suzhou, strong ones from Shandong, young ones from Hunan. Regional specialization in human trafficking, though the exact details are uncertain. These traders kept their own records, some of which survive in private collections. Purchase prices, usually a pittance. Transport costs, bribes to officials. They calculated profit margins on human misery. Some became wealthy, built houses with gardens, sent their own daughters to good schools. The money from destroyed girls buying intact futures for others. Back to your daily life. After a year in laundry, you're moved to the kitchens. It's harder work, but better in some ways. The heat from the stoves is brutal, but it's warm in winter. You're preparing food you'll never eat. Elaborate dishes that take days while you survive on thin porridge twice daily. You learn to cook shark fin soup, which takes 3 days of preparation. Bird's nest delicacy that costs more than your family made in a lifetime. Your hands shake from malnutrition while you prepare feasts for people who've never been hungry. The irony stops registering after a while. It's just what you do. Wei follows you to the kitchen. Or maybe it's a different rat you've decided is Wei. The continuity matters more than accuracy. He's grown fatter on kitchen scraps. Sometimes you save him a grain of rice. It's the closest thing to friendship you have, feeding a rat who doesn't fear you. The kitchen has its own hierarchies. The head cook is a woman who's been here 40 years. She started like you, but showed talent for cooking. Now she manages dozens of modified women. She's neither kind nor cruel, just efficient. She remembers being where you are. That memory makes her harder, not softer. You learn the palace routines, when the emperor eats, what his favorite dishes are, how many food tasters check each meal. You learn that paranoia is reasonable when everyone wants you dead. The emperor has survived 3 poisoning attempts this year. The kitchen staff who prepared those meals were executed, even though they probably weren't involved. The new girls arrive every month. You don't comfort them. Nobody comforted you. But you do show them practical things. Which stores of rice are less likely to have weevils? How to steal herbs that help with pain? Where to hide during the worst shifts? Not kindness exactly, just efficient transfer of survival information. One girl, maybe 13, reminds you of your sister. Same way of tilting her head when confused. She doesn't survive the first winter. Infection, probably, though nobody investigates. You steal a small piece of cloth. Earn it. Keep the ashes. Tell yourself they're hers, even though they were cremated in mass. It's the only funeral she'll get. You're 18 when the emperor dies. Poisoned, everyone whispers, though officially it was sudden illness. The palace erupts in chaos as different factions fight for control. During the confusion, some slaves escape. You don't try. Where would someone like you go? Your body marks you as palace property. Any village would know immediately what you are. The new emperor is a child, only 8 years old. His mother, Empress Dowager Lu, rules as regent. She understands female bodies in ways the men never did, which makes her cruelty more precise. She knows exactly what causes maximum discomfort without visible damage. Under her rule, the death rate among female eunuchs triples. The Empress Dowager has specific ideas about female eunuchs. She thinks you're all potentially dangerous, even destroyed as you are. She institutes new controls, random searches of quarters, restrictions on gathering in groups, punishments for any sign of solidarity. She's probably paranoid, but paranoia and reasonable caution look the same from power. You're moved to the stables. It's actually better than kitchen work. Horses don't care what you are. They just want food and clean stalls. The stable boys ignore you completely. You're not a woman to them, not even a person. Just another tool like a shovel or bucket. This invisibility is a gift. The work is hard, but straightforward. Mucking stalls, hauling water, distributing feed. Your body hurts constantly, but it's a familiar hurt now. You've learned to work through it. Pain is just another aspect of existence, like breathing or hunger. Wei finds you in the stables. Definitely a different rat, but you maintain the fiction. He makes a nest in the hay near where you sleep. The horses ignore him. Sometimes at night, you hear him moving around, and it's comforting. Proof that something else is alive in the darkness. Seasons blur together. You stop counting years. Time is measured differently now. How many steps you can take before resting. How much water you can carry before your arms give out. How long you can work before the pain makes you vomit. Your world has shrunk to these measurements. The stable is where you learn about the larger world. The stable boys talk freely, forgetting you exist. Political plots, which concubines are pregnant, which princes are positioning for power. Information is currency in the palace. You start trading what you hear for small improvements. Extra food, medicine for pain, slightly better sleeping arrangements. A new doctor arrives at the palace. He's interested in female eunuchs from what he calls a medical perspective. He examines dozens of you, taking notes, making drawings. According to his surviving texts, though some scholars question their authenticity, he's trying to understand how bodies adapt to major trauma. You're data points in his research. The doctor is neither kind nor cruel, just curious. He asks questions about your experience. First time anyone has asked, You tell him about the constant pain, the way your body doesn't work right, the isolation. He writes it all down. His notes will survive in medical archives while your name disappears. You're 20 when the Empress Dowager dies. Officially, it's illness. Unofficially, everyone knows her own son had her killed. He's 16 now, ready to rule himself. The palace relaxes slightly. The new emperor has different interests. He cares about poetry and art, not the detailed control of servants. Under the new emperor, conditions improve marginally. Not from compassion, but from indifference. He doesn't care about female eunuchs enough to actively persecute you. Benign neglect is the best you can hope for from power. But the system continues. New girls arrive. Undergo procedures. Learn to walk differently. Learn to manage damaged bodies. The machine of palace service continues regardless of who sits on the throne. Individual emperors matter less than the structure that creates and maintains them. You're moved to the gardens. Age is catching up even though you're only 21. The stable work is too hard now. In the gardens, you pull weeds, trim plants, maintain the spaces where nobles walk. It's lighter work, but requires constant bending. Different pain, same endurance. The garden has a pond with expensive fish. They swim in endless circles, bred for colors that don't exist in nature, fed special food to maintain their unnatural beauty, living their entire lives in a small space for someone else's pleasure. You understand these fish. A younger woman is assigned to help you. Maybe 14, recently modified. She asks if it gets easier. You tell her the truth. No, it doesn't get easier. Your body just gets more damaged until it finally stops. She cries. You don't comfort her, but you do teach her which plants help with pain if you can steal them. Let's talk about the foreign observers who documented female eunuchs, though their accounts vary wildly in reliability. The Jesuit missionaries were horrified, writing to Rome about the unspeakable modifications they witnessed. Though some historians argue they exaggerated for effect, trying to emphasize the need for Christian conversion. Father Matteo Ricci, whose letters survive in Vatican archives, described encountering female eunuchs in 1605. He noted their distinctive walk, their obvious suffering. His superiors didn't believe him initially. The idea seemed too systematically cruel. His accounts were edited before publication. References to female eunuchs removed as too disturbing for European readers. The Korean ambassadors wrote matter-of-factly about female eunuchs. Korea had its own version of the practice, though apparently less extensive. Their reports, preserved in Seoul, treat it as administrative detail. They note Chinese techniques were more severe than Korean ones, commented on efficiency of using modified women for certain palace tasks. Marco Polo mentioned female eunuchs, but European translators assumed he was confused or exaggerating. Modern scholars debate whether his account was accurate or if he was conflating different practices. The difficulty of translation across cultures and centuries makes certainty impossible. The Mongols who conquered China initially saw female eunuchs as evidence of Chinese weakness. But according to Yuan dynasty records, though these might be propaganda, they quickly adopted the practice themselves. Within a generation, Mongol nobles were modifying captured Chinese women and their own servants. Japanese visitors during the Ming dynasty wrote about female eunuchs in travel accounts that survive in Kyoto archives. They were disturbed but pragmatic. Some suggested Japan adopt the practice for the shogun's palace. It was considered, but rejected as too foreign. Cultural pride preventing adoption of atrocity, or perhaps simple practicality. Back to your life. You're 25 now. Your body is failing faster. The constant pain has become a grinding agony that makes thought difficult. The infections that were occasional are now constant. The palace doctor, examining you like livestock, estimates you have a year, maybe two. They move you to what everyone calls the death quarters, though officially they're recovery rooms. Stone chambers in the oldest part of the palace. Damp, cold, flooding when it rains. Food comes twice a day. Bodies are removed once a week. You're warehoused here to die as quietly as possible. Your roommate claims she was beautiful once. Maybe she was. Beauty doesn't survive here. She tells you she was the daughter of a general who fell from favor. Her whole family was destroyed in different ways. She dies within a month. They don't remove her body for 3 days. You sleep next to a corpse because moving requires energy you don't have. The death quarters have their own culture. Women who know they're dying share what little they have. A cleaner rag, a softer sleeping spot, information about which time's food delivery might include something extra. These tiny kindnesses matter enormously when you have nothing. Some women in the death quarters tell their stories obsessively, trying to make someone remember them specifically, not as a category, but as an individual who had a name, a family, a life before the palace. Most listeners are too consumed by their own dying to really hear. But sometimes someone remembers. Wei finds you even here. Probably the 10th rat you've called Wei by now. He's old too, moving slowly, fur patchy. 2 ancient creatures waiting for an ending. He sleeps near you at night. During the day, he forages for food you're too weak to eat. The relationship has reversed. Now he's taking care of you. Winter in the death quarters is brutal. No heating. Thin blankets that don't dry properly. The stones leach cold into your bones. Women die faster in winter. Sometimes 3 or 4 in a single night. By morning, the bodies are frozen to the floor. Spring is slightly better. Warmer air means you might survive another season. But it also means faster decomposition when someone dies. The smell becomes overwhelming. You breathe through your mouth and try to remember what clean air felt like. You develop a fever that doesn't break. For days, you drift between consciousness and delirium. In your fever dreams, you're home. Your mother is cooking. Your sister is laughing. Your father is telling stories. Then you wake to stone walls and the smell of death. A young male eunuch brings water. He's maybe 15, modified young enough that he never developed as a man. He helps you drink, says nothing, just ensures you get liquid. It's the first kindness from another person in years. When he leaves, you cry. You'd forgotten you could still cry. The fever breaks, but leaves you weaker. You can barely move now. Wei brings you crumbs, drops them near your hand. You can't eat them, but you appreciate the gesture. He's the only consistent relationship you've had for 15 years. A rat. That's what your life reduced to. You last through summer. Autumn comes with its false promise of relief. The air cools, but your body is beyond responding to seasons. You're just waiting now. Not hoping, not fearing, just waiting for the mechanical processes to stop. Wei dies curled against your side one night. You feel him stop breathing. Such a small death, but it matters. He was your only constant. You wrap his small body in a piece of cloth you've saved. Can't bury him, but at least he's covered. It's more dignity than you'll get. You survive another month after Wei dies. Mostly unconscious, body continuing through pure habit. The last clear thought you have is about your sister. She'd be grown now, maybe 28, probably married with children. You hope she forgot she had an older sister. Better to think you died quick than know you survived like this. You die alone on an ordinary Tuesday. Nobody notices for 2 days. When they finally check, they find you've scratched patterns into the stone floor with your fingernails. Circles within circles, like the fish in the pond, like your life in the palace. like the endless repetition of suffering that defines this place. Your body is burned with 5 others. Mass cremation is more efficient. Your ashes are scattered in the river where thousands like you were scattered before. No name on any monument. No record you specifically existed. Just one of countless women whose bodies were destroyed for the convenience of power. But let's zoom out from your individual story and talk about the system that created you. The economics, politics, and social structures that normalized such practices for 3,000 years. Though much of what we know comes from fragmentary sources, often contradictory, sometimes possibly exaggerated. According to various historical estimates, though scholars debate these numbers, there were between tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of female eunuchs across Chinese history. The practice allegedly began in the Shang dynasty, around 1600 BCE, though the evidence is mostly inferential. Oracle bones mention purified women in palace service, which some interpret as reference to modification. By the Zhou dynasty, the practice was apparently more established. Bronze tools specifically designed for the procedure have been found in archaeological sites, though their exact use is debated. Some argue they were general surgical instruments. Others insist their design indicates specific purpose. The Han dynasty, where your story was set, supposedly employed 3,000 female eunuchs in the capital alone. This number comes from a single source that might have been exaggerating. Other accounts suggest fewer. The truth is probably somewhere between, but even conservative estimates mean thousands of women. The Tang dynasty, often called China's Golden Age, was allegedly also the peak of female eunuch employment. Palace records, though many were destroyed in later dynasties, suggest 5,000 modified women in Chang'an. They had their own quarters, their own medical staff, their own burial grounds, an entire infrastructure of suffering. The Song dynasty brought what some sources call refinements to the practice. Medical texts from this period describe different grades of modification, though modern scholars debate whether these texts are authentic or later fabrications. The descriptions are detailed, but might be theoretical rather than practical. The Yuan dynasty under the Mongols initially rejected the practice, according to some accounts. Other sources claim they embraced it enthusiastically. The contradictions might reflect different periods or different Mongol rulers. Historical certainty is impossible when records conflict. The Ming dynasty allegedly industrialized the process. Modification centers that could handle multiple procedures daily. Assembly line suffering. But these claims come from Qing dynasty sources that had reason to exaggerate Ming cruelty. Propaganda disguised as history. The Qing, China's last dynasty, continued the practice until the very end. Western observers in the late 1800s documented female eunuchs in the Forbidden City, though their accounts vary in reliability. Some were clearly sensationalizing for European audiences. Others seem more factual, but still filtered through cultural prejudice. The practice officially ended with the dynasty in 1912, but some sources claim cases into the 1920s or even 1930s. The last verified female eunuch, if the records are accurate, died in the 1990s. She never spoke publicly about her experience. Most didn't. The shame was too deep. Let's talk about the medical aspects, though warning. Historical medical texts are often inaccurate by modern standards. Ancient Chinese doctors documented procedures in detail that would be considered torture today, but they saw it as necessary modification for social order. The procedures varied by dynasty, and sometimes by individual doctor. Some sources describe minimal modification. Others describe complete external removal. The truth probably varied case by case, though patients had no choice in their treatment. Medical decisions were made by others for economic and social reasons. The survival rate is heavily debated. Some sources claim 60%. Others say 90%. The discrepancy might reflect different time periods, different procedures, or simple exaggeration. What's certain is that many died, either immediately or from complications. The long-term effects were severe: chronic pain, infection, incontinence, psychological trauma. Though ancient sources don't use modern medical terminology, the descriptions clearly indicate massive, lasting damage. Bodies modified for others' convenience, not the person's well-being. The doctors who performed these procedures were respected professionals. They wrote medical texts, trained students, attended conferences. They saw no contradiction between healing and harming. Or perhaps they did, but economic incentives overruled conscience. We can't know their inner thoughts, only their actions. The tools evolved over centuries. Stone, bronze, iron, eventually steel. Each improvement in metallurgy meant cleaner cuts, better survival rates. Technology serving suffering. The tools themselves became sophisticated, specialized for specific aspects of the procedure. Some museums have these tools in storage. Not on display, too disturbing for general audiences. They're classified as medical instruments, which technically they were, but calling them that obscures their purpose. Language sanitizing atrocity. The economic structure around female eunuchs was complex. Traders, transporters, doctors, administrators. An entire industry built on modifying women's bodies. Some people got rich. The women themselves got nothing but pain. The prices varied by era and source. Some records say 5 taels of silver for a girl. Others say 50. The procedure itself cost more. Then there were ongoing medical costs. The economics were carefully calculated. Human suffering converted to accounting. The families who sold daughters faced impossible choices: starvation or selling a child. Some convinced themselves palace service was opportunity. Better fed as a slave than dead from hunger. The mathematics of desperation making atrocity seem like mercy. Some regions became known for providing girls. Beautiful ones from Suzhou, strong ones from Shandong. Whether this was real specialization or stereotyping is unknown, but the trade routes were real. The infrastructure of human trafficking spanning the empire. The palace hierarchy was complex. Female eunuchs at the bottom, but with gradations. Those who served nobles directly had slightly higher status than laundry workers. Those partially modified looked down on those completely modified. Even in suffering, humans create hierarchies. The relationship between female eunuchs and intact palace women was fraught. Fear, disgust, pity, sometimes solidarity. Some intact women were kind, smuggling food or medicine. Others were cruel, seeing female eunuchs as reminders of what could happen to them. The male eunuchs occupied a different position. Some achieved power, wealth, influence. Female eunuchs never did. The intersection of gender and modification created different possibilities. Or rather, for women, no possibilities at all. Children in the palace grew up seeing female eunuchs as normal. By adulthood, the suffering was background noise. This normalization across generations ensured continuation, each generation accepting what the previous one made standard. Foreign observers provide some of our only outside perspectives, though these are filtered through their own cultural biases. Jesuits were horrified. Muslims compared it to their own practices. Buddhists saw it as karma, each culture interpreting through their own lens. The language used to describe female eunuchs was always euphemistic. Purified women, modified servants, never what they actually were, mutilated slaves. Language shapes thought, euphemism enabling atrocity. Modern China doesn't acknowledge female eunuchs in museums or education. They're historical inconvenience, evidence of systematic cruelty that lasted millennia. easier to forget than to face. The erasure continues. The Forbidden City, now a tourist destination, has no markers for where these women lived and died. The modification rooms are storage. The death quarters demolished. Every physical trace erased or repurposed. History sanitized for comfortable consumption. Some scholars argue the practice wasn't as widespread as claimed. They point to limited documentation. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. These women weren't documented because they didn't matter to those keeping records. Others claim the suffering is exaggerated, that historical accounts sensationalize. Perhaps some do. But even conservative interpretations indicate systematic atrocity. The scale might be debated, but the reality isn't. The last word should go to them. The thousands whose voices were never recorded, who suffered in silence, who died forgotten, who existed as background suffering in every dynasty, every palace, every supposed golden age. They were real. They felt everything. They mattered. Think about the mathematics one more time. Even taking the most conservative estimates, say 10,000 women over 3,000 years, living an average of 10 years post-modification. That's 100,000 years of collective pain, longer than human civilization. An ocean of suffering reduced to footnotes. But they weren't statistics. Each one was individual. Each had a name before it was replaced with a number. Each had a family before being sold or taken. Each felt every moment of pain, every indignity, every day of living in a body destroyed for someone else's convenience. The female eunuchs of ancient China represent one of history's longest systematic atrocities. 3,000 years of women modified for palace service. Their suffering enabled the beautiful palaces tourists photograph. Their pain maintained the silk and poetry and art we admire. Civilization and cruelty aren't opposites. They coexist. Every beautiful artifact was maintained by suffering. Every emperor who wrote about honor was served by women whose bodies had been destroyed. Every golden age had its foundation in someone's pain. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep in your intact body, in your world where such things are history, remember them. Not the graphic details, but the human reality. Thousands of women whose bodies were controlled by empire, who lived in pain for others' convenience, who died forgotten but were real. Remember that forgetting enables repetition, that erasure serves power, that comfortable history is incomplete history. The female eunuchs deserve more than footnotes. They deserve remembrance as complete humans who suffered real pain. Close your eyes. Let sleep come. And in that space between waking and dreams, spare a thought for Wei and all the small creatures who witnessed suffering without judgment, for the women who couldn't sleep from pain, for the ones who needed help for basic functions, for those whose names became numbers. Their story is over. Yours continues. Make it matter. The silence surrounding female eunuchs extends beyond China. Every culture that practiced similar modifications has engaged in comparable erasure. The Ottoman Empire's female servants. African kingdoms modified women. Pre-Columbian American practices. All minimized, euphemized, or completely denied in official histories. This global pattern suggests something fundamental about how societies handle their atrocities. Acknowledgement requires confronting complicity. Easier to forget than to face what ancestors did, what we might be capable of doing. The female eunuchs remind us of human capacity for systematic cruelty. Let's talk about what we actually know versus what we assume. The documented facts are sparse. Palace employment records mentioning categories of female servants. Medical texts describing procedures, though these might be theoretical rather than practical guides. Archaeological evidence of modified remains. Financial records showing purchases and expenses. Everything else is inference, interpretation, reconstruction. We assume the women suffered, because how could they not? We assume systematic practice, because the infrastructure existed. We assume large numbers, because the facilities could handle them. But assumption isn't fact, even reasonable assumption. This uncertainty doesn't diminish the reality. Even if numbers are inflated, even if some accounts exaggerate, the core truth remains. Women were surgically modified for palace service. They lived with damaged bodies. They died young. The details might be debated, but the fundamental atrocity isn't. The comparison to modern practices is unavoidable but complicated. Female genital modification continues globally. Different cultures, different justifications, same basic impulse to control female sexuality through surgery. The techniques vary. The suffering doesn't. But historical distance makes condemnation easier. We can criticize ancient China without implicating ourselves. We can express horror at their practices while ignoring our own. The female eunuchs become safe targets for moral outrage. Dead victims can't challenge living hypocrisies. The medicalization of the practice parallels modern medical ethics debates. When does medical intervention become harm? Who decides what modifications are acceptable? The Chinese doctors who performed modifications saw themselves as healers. Modern doctors performing similar procedures make similar claims. This isn't moral relativism. The suffering was real regardless of cultural context. But understanding how atrocity becomes normalized helps prevent repetition. The female eunuchs show how gradually, systematically, with institutional support, the unthinkable becomes routine. You're back in your story now, but in the Qing dynasty, the last imperial era. It's 1890. You're 12, from a Manchu family that fell from favor. The Empress Dowager Cixi ordered your modification personally. She likes to control every detail of palace operations. The Qing procedures are supposedly more refined than previous dynasties. The doctors use steel instruments, imported antiseptics, even primitive anesthesia. The survival rate is higher. You'll live longer with your modifications. This isn't progress, just prolonged suffering with better documentation. Your assignment is to the Empress Dowager's personal quarters. She collects modified girls like artifacts. Different types of modifications, creating different capabilities. You're completely modified, useful for tasks requiring no distraction. She watches you work sometimes, studying your movements with scientific curiosity. Wei appears here too, because Wei always appears. This one is sleek and well-fed, stealing food from the Empress's own table. Even Cixi doesn't notice him. Or maybe she does and doesn't care. Rats are the least of her concerns. She's managing an empire in decline. The foreign legations in Beijing know about female eunuchs. Diplomatic wives whisper about them at tea parties. Missionary doctors write reports, but it's treated as Oriental curiosity rather than humanitarian crisis. The suffering of foreign women in foreign palaces doesn't demand action. Some missionaries try to help escaped female eunuchs. Provide medical care, teach skills, offer conversion. But the help comes with conditions. Accept Christianity. Abandon Chinese practices. Become evidence of Western superiority. Even charity has agenda. The Boxer Rebellion of 1900 disrupts everything. Foreign armies occupy Beijing. The palace is looted. During the chaos, many female eunuchs are abandoned. Some are taken by soldiers as curiosities. Others starve in the abandoned palace. A few escape to uncertain freedom. You survive the rebellion because you're useful to whoever controls the palace. Foreign officers, Chinese administrators, returning imperial family. Everyone needs servants. Your modifications make you safe, incapable of compromising anyone. Political neutrality through physical destruction. The photographs taken during this period Carefully exclude female eunuchs. Plenty of images of the Empress Dowager, palace buildings, even male eunuchs. But modified women are kept out of frame. Their existence too shameful for the modern medium of photography. When the empire finally falls in 1912, you're 33, ancient for a female eunuch. Your body is failing comprehensively. The new republic has no place for imperial servants. You're given a small payment and told to leave. Where does someone like you go after a lifetime in palace walls? Some female eunuchs form communities in Beijing's slums, sharing resources, caring for each other, creating families of choice among the damaged. These communities leave few records. Poor women's mutual aid doesn't make history books. Others attach themselves to wealthy households as servants. Their modifications make them trustworthy around valuable items and important men. The Republic might have ended imperial service, but wealthy families still want controllable servants. You find work in a Western missionary hospital. They need someone to clean surgical equipment. Your experience with pain and bodily horror makes you ideal for the job. You see modern medical procedures that remind you of your own modification. Technology changes. Suffering continues. The doctors at the hospital are fascinated by your modifications. They want to examine you, document you, maybe even attempt reconstruction. You refuse. Your body has been medical curiosity enough. You just want to work, survive, eventually die quietly. But quiet death isn't available. The warlord period brings violence to Beijing. Different factions controlling different districts. Female eunuchs are valuable to all sides. Can't be used for pleasure. Can't produce children, perfect servants for violent men. You're traded between warlords like furniture. The Japanese invasion adds another layer of suffering. They're interested in female eunuchs as examples of Chinese barbarism. Proof of cultural inferiority requiring Japanese guidance. You become propaganda. Your suffering weaponized against your own culture. Some Japanese doctors want to study the modifications. Compare them to their own medical practices. Learn techniques that might be useful. Even in occupation, the medical curiosity continues. Your body remains object of study rather than subject of compassion. The communist revolution promises liberation for all oppressed people. Female eunuchs are declared victims of feudal oppression. But liberation doesn't restore your body, doesn't erase decades of pain, doesn't provide skills for new society. You're free in theory, trapped in practice. During land reform, some female eunuchs are given small plots. But farming requires physical strength you don't have. The modifications make certain movements impossible. The land goes uncultivated. You sell it for food, return to cities where anonymity is possible. The Great Leap Forward demands everyone contribute to national development. But what can you contribute? Your only skills are palace service. Your body is too damaged for factory work. You're classified as unproductive element, burden on socialist construction. The Cultural Revolution is worse. Red Guards see you as living symbol of imperial decadence. They parade you through streets as example of old China's crimes, make you confess to serving emperors, though you had no choice, punish you for being victim. You're in your 80s now, if this were possible. It isn't. Female eunuchs didn't live this long, but imagine you did. Imagine surviving every dynasty change, every revolution, every promise of liberation that didn't liberate. Your body carrying history's scars into modern China. The economic reforms of the 1980s bring prosperity, but not for you. Too old, too damaged, too marked by history. You survive on small pension for imperial servants. Yes, the communist government eventually provided pensions. Tiny acknowledgement of massive suffering. Scholars occasionally interview you. want to document your experience before you die. But their questions focus on palace life, not your suffering. They want colorful details about emperors, not mundane reality of living in destroyed body. Your pain edited out even from your own testimony. You die in 1996, the last of your kind. The nurses don't understand your body's peculiarities, don't recognize the significance of the bronze tube among your possessions. You're cremated in municipal facility, ashes scattered without ceremony. The last female eunuch disappearing into anonymity. But this extended story is fiction. Most female eunuchs died young. The few who survived into the 20th century didn't live to see communist China, let alone reform era. Their suffering was temporally bounded even if its effects weren't. What survived was the silence, the deliberate forgetting, the systematic erasure from history. Each generation knowing less about female eunuchs than the previous, until they become myth, then footnote, then nothing. Modern Chinese students learn about the Forbidden City's architecture, not the women who cleaned it. Study Tang poetry without learning about the servants who enabled poets' leisure. Admire Ming porcelain without knowing whose hands washed it. Education maintaining comfortable ignorance. When pressed, officials acknowledge female eunuchs existed, but minimize their numbers and suffering. A few thousand across all history, they claim. Voluntary in many cases. Not as bad as Western sources suggest. Deflection and denial as policy, but the evidence persists. In museum storage rooms, in restricted archives, in archaeological sites quickly covered, in family memories never shared. Truth has persistence even when power wants forgetting. The economics of remembering are unfavorable. Acknowledging female eunuchs would require confronting systematic atrocity, might inspire uncomfortable questions about current practices, could complicate nationalism built on civilizational superiority. Forgetting is cheaper than remembering. International pressure for acknowledgement is minimal. Female eunuchs aren't genocide victims demanding justice, not war crimes requiring tribunals, just centuries of suffering without perpetrators to prosecute. Historical atrocity without contemporary constituency. Academic study continues quietly. Dissertations written, papers published in obscure journals, knowledge accumulated in specialist circles. But this scholarship doesn't reach public consciousness. Remains confined to those already interested. The language barrier contributes to ignorance. Primary sources in classical Chinese, secondary sources often untranslated. Western scholars dependent on limited translations. Chinese scholars self-censoring for political safety. Truth fragmented across languages and cultures. Digital humanities could revolutionize study of female eunuchs. Database of all references. Mapping of trade routes. Analysis of economic records. Correlation of medical texts with archaeological evidence. But this requires institutional support, unlikely to materialize. Meanwhile, the last physical traces disappear. Urban development destroys unmarked burial sites. Private collections disperse as owners die. Documents deteriorate without preservation. Evidence of hundreds of thousands of women vanishing into historical void. The moral questions remain relevant. How do we remember suffering without exploiting it? How do we honor victims without appropriating their pain? How do we learn from atrocity without normalizing it? The female eunuchs pose these questions without providing answers. Their suffering was specific, but its patterns are universal. Bodies controlled by power. Economics justifying atrocity. Medicine serving oppression. Language obscuring reality. Institutions normalizing horror. These patterns repeat across cultures and centuries. Modern parallels are everywhere if we choose to see them. Workers whose bodies are destroyed by labor. women whose sexuality is surgically controlled, people whose suffering is economically productive for others. The female eunuchs weren't unique, just extremely visible examples of common patterns. But visibility doesn't guarantee recognition. The female eunuchs were visible in every palace for 3,000 years. Their suffering was obvious to everyone who saw them. Yet they remained unrecognized as full humans deserving better. Visibility without recognition is just display. The question isn't whether female eunuchs existed or suffered. The evidence, even fragmented, is overwhelming. The question is why we choose to forget. What forgetting serves? Who benefits from historical amnesia? Power benefits. Forgetting female eunuchs means forgetting that civilization and cruelty coexist, that beauty requires suffering, that progress doesn't eliminate atrocity, just refines it. Comfortable lies requiring uncomfortable forgetting. We benefit too. Forgetting female eunuchs means not confronting human capacity for systematic cruelty, not recognizing patterns we might be repeating, not questioning systems we participate in. Ignorance as moral convenience. But forgetting has costs. Unexamined history repeats. Unacknowledged suffering continues. Unlearned lessons remain unlearned. The female eunuchs matter not just as historical victims, but as warning about what humans can normalize. Their story reveals how atrocity becomes routine. First, economic incentive. Then, institutional structure. Professional specialization. Bureaucratic language. Cultural normalization. Individual suffering disappearing into systematic process. The machinery of dehumanization operating smoothly. It also reveals resistance. Women surviving despite everything, creating connections in isolation, maintaining humanity in dehumanizing conditions, finding meaning in meaninglessness, the persistence of human spirit even in destroyed bodies. Way the rat represents this persistence, fictional but necessary. The need for witness, for companionship, for recognition transcending species barriers. When humans fail humanity, even rats become relatives. Connection asserting itself despite everything. The female eunuchs deserve better than they received. In life, they deserve intact bodies and free choices. In death, they deserve remembrance and recognition. In history, they deserve more than footnotes and denial. But deserving doesn't mean receiving. The female eunuchs got nothing they deserved. Their story is about that gap between deserving and receiving, about lives lived in that gap, about dying without closing it. Tonight, you've learned about that gap, about women who fell through it, about suffering so vast it becomes abstract, so specific it becomes universal, about history's victims who are also history's teachers, if we choose to learn. The lesson isn't simple. Not just atrocity bad or remember victims. The lesson is about how normal people create abnormal suffering, how reasonable systems produce unreasonable results, how everyday choices aggregate to historical horror. You are not immune. Your society, whatever it is, has its own female eunuchs, people whose suffering enables your comfort, whose bodies bear the cost of your consumption, whose humanity is sacrificed for your convenience. They're visible if you choose to see, but seeing requires discomfort, requires questioning what you've normalized, requires recognizing your participation in systems of suffering. Easier to focus on historical atrocity. Safe distance from ancient China. The female eunuchs can't challenge your comfort. They're dead. Their suffering is complete. You can feel appropriate horror without changing anything. Historical atrocity is moral entertainment, suffering consumed like content. But maybe learning about them changes something. Maybe knowing they existed, suffered, and died forgotten makes forgetting harder. Maybe their story creates small recognition that prevents future erasure. Maybe remembering matters even when it doesn't change anything. Or maybe not. Maybe you'll forget them by tomorrow. Maybe their story joins the pile of historical horrors you've consumed. Maybe they remain footnotes even after 15,000 words. Forgetting is easier than remembering. But for tonight, for these moments before sleep, they exist in your consciousness. The female eunuchs of ancient China are real to you. Their suffering acknowledged, their humanity recognized, their story told, however imperfectly. That's all we can offer the dead. Recognition, remembrance, refusal to let them disappear completely. The female eunuchs existed. They mattered. They deserve better than forgetting. So as sleep approaches, carrying you away from their story, try to remember. Not the details that will fade, not the numbers that numb, but the fundamental truth. Thousands of women suffered for thousands of years. Their suffering was real. They were real. Remember Wei, who represented all the small witnesses to great suffering. Remember the bronze tubes that became chains worn inside bodies. Remember the careful walk that marked women forever. Remember the silence that followed them from life into history. Remember that every beautiful palace photo you see was maintained by mutilated women. Every piece of imperial silk was washed by damaged hands. Every emperor's poem was written while female eunuchs suffered in silence nearby. Beauty and brutality intertwined. Remember that forgetting enables repetition, that silence serves power, that comfortable history is incomplete history, that atrocity becomes normal through small acceptances, that everyone is capable of participating in systematic horror. But also remember resistance, survival as rebellion, connection despite isolation, humanity persisting in dehumanization. The women who lived decades in destroyed bodies, who created meaning from meaninglessness, who refused to disappear completely. The architecture of their suffering has been demolished. The documents are restricted. The evidence is hidden. But truth persists in fragments. In bronze tubes in museum storage, in bones showing modification, in scratches on ancient stones, in the silence that marks where voices should be. Those fragments matter. They're all that remains of hundreds of thousands of individual lives. Each fragment representing someone who lived, suffered, and died. Someone whose name became number, whose body became property, whose humanity was denied but not destroyed. The female eunuchs of ancient China existed for 3,000 years. They suffered systematically. They died forgotten. They deserve remembrance. They won't get what they deserve. They never did. But knowing they existed matters. Recognition matters. Remembrance matters. Even if it changes nothing. Even if tomorrow brings forgetting. Even if their story remains marginal. For tonight, they exist. They matter. They're real. Sleep comes soon. Your body is intact. Your choices are yours. Your suffering, whatever it is, isn't systematic surgical modification. You're free in ways they never were. That freedom built partially on their suffering. All freedom built on someone's suffering. Don't feel guilty. Guilt helps nothing. But don't forget either. Carry some small memory of them forward. The female eunuchs of ancient China. Modified for service, suffering in silence, dying forgotten. But real, always real. Close your eyes. Let consciousness fade. Let sleep take you. But first, one last thought for them. For the women who couldn't sleep from pain, who walked carefully to minimize suffering, who carried bronze tubes as badges of ownership, who lived and died as property. They existed. They mattered. They were human. Remember them. Sleep well. The architecture of suffering deserves attention. Every major palace complex in China had specialized spaces for female eunuchs. Not just living quarters, but entire infrastructures. modification rooms, recovery wards, work areas, death quarters. Buildings designed around the expectation of systematic mutilation. The Forbidden City, which tourists walk through taking selfies, contains these spaces. They're not marked. The modification rooms are now storage for cleaning supplies. Ironic or appropriate, depending on your perspective. The recovery wards are gift shops. The death quarters were demolished in the 1960s for a parking lot. Archaeological evidence tells stories that written records don't. Specialized drainage systems for blood and waste. Stone tables with restraint marks. Collections of medical instruments whose purpose is obvious from design. Physical evidence that can't be edited or euphemized. But this evidence isn't publicized. It sits in storage rooms, in restricted archives, in archaeological reports that few read. Even when we have proof, we choose not to see it. Comfortable history requires selective blindness. The economic impact of female eunuchs on palace budgets was significant. Some historians estimate, though these calculations are necessarily speculative, that maintaining female eunuchs cost up to 5% of palace expenditures. Salaries for doctors, cost of modifications, medical care for complications, disposal of bodies. Suffering as budget line, the trade networks that supplied girls to palaces were extensive and sophisticated. Routes from rural areas to capitals, way stations for holding and sorting, systems for avoiding bandits who might steal or damage the cargo. Yes, cargo. That's how the girls were classified in transport documents. Some traders became wealthy enough to buy titles and land. Their children became scholars and officials. Fortunes built on destroyed girls' bodies. Social nobility through others' immobility. The economics of atrocity creating new aristocracies. Regional variations in practice haven't been fully studied. Northern China allegedly preferred one type of modification. Southern China, another. Western regions had their own approaches. But these variations are poorly documented. We know difference existed, but not details. The influence of female eunuchs on palace culture is underexplored. They were present at every level of palace life. Cleaning, cooking, serving, maintaining. Their invisible labor enabled the visible culture we celebrate. Every beautiful artifact was maintained by damaged hands. Some female eunuchs developed specialized skills that made them valuable despite their status. Expertise in herbs, talent for embroidery, ability to manage other servants. These skills didn't improve their condition much, but might mean slightly better quarters or food. The medical knowledge gained from female eunuchs contributed to Chinese medical development. Understanding of infection, wound care, chronic pain management. Knowledge built on suffering. Medical advancement through systematic harm. Traditional Chinese medicine includes treatments specifically developed for female eunuch complications. Herbal formulas for chronic infections. Acupuncture points for pelvic pain. Techniques refined over centuries of treating modified women. Their suffering codified into medical practice. The psychological impact of modification is barely mentioned in historical sources. Physical symptoms were documented because they affected work capacity. Mental suffering wasn't considered relevant. But trauma doesn't disappear because it's undocumented. Modern psychology would recognize complex PTSD, dissociation, severe depression. But these terms didn't exist. The women just lived with minds as damaged as their bodies. Mental illness untreated because unrecognized, or recognized but considered unimportant. The few mentions of psychological symptoms in historical records are telling. Women who stopped speaking, who stared at walls for hours, who had to be forced to eat, what we'd now call catatonic depression or selective mutism. Then, just laziness requiring punishment. Suicide among female eunuchs was common enough to require prevention measures, removing potential means, constant surveillance, punishments for attempts. The palace needed their labor. Their desire to die was inconvenient, so they were forced to continue. But some found ways, refusing food until they starved, finding poisons in the herbs they handled, throwing themselves from heights, small rebellions of self-destruction in a life already destroyed, choosing the terms of their own ending. The language female eunuchs developed among themselves is completely lost. They must have had terms for their specific experiences, words for different types of pain, names for complications, descriptions of daily struggles, an entire vocabulary of suffering that died with its speakers. Some linguists speculate, though evidence is minimal, that female eunuchs might have developed sign languages or coded communications, ways to share information without supervisors' understanding, silent languages for silenced women. But if these existed, they left no trace. The influence on Chinese literature is present but unacknowledged. Writers who grew up in palaces served by female eunuchs must have been influenced, but direct mentions are rare. The suffering was too uncomfortable for art. Better to focus on beauty than the destroyed women maintaining it. When female eunuchs do appear in literature, their background, nameless servants enabling plot without participating. They exist to show the protagonist's kindness or cruelty. Props demonstrating character through how they treat the untreatable. The absence from art is equally telling. Thousands of paintings of palace life. Emperors, concubines, gardens, celebrations. No female eunuchs. They were edited out visually as they were textually. Present everywhere, depicted nowhere. Foreign art occasionally includes what might be female eunuchs. European paintings of Chinese courts sometimes show women with distinctive postures in the background. But without documentation, we can't be certain. They might just be artistic interpretation. The role of female eunuchs in palace intrigue is underexplored. They were present during private conversations. They handled personal items. They knew secrets, but they had no power to use this knowledge. Information without agency is just burden. Some historians speculate, though evidence is fragmentary, that female eunuchs occasionally participated in palace plots, carrying messages, poisoning food, providing alibis. But these stories might be fiction. Powerless people make convenient scapegoats. The relationship between female eunuchs and religion is complex. Buddhism taught that suffering was karma from past lives. This could mean female eunuchs deserved their fate, or that they were working off karmic debt. Religious interpretation of atrocity varied by sect and teacher. Some Buddhist monasteries provided refuge for elderly female eunuchs, not from compassion necessarily, but for the merit gained by caring for the suffering. The women's pain became others' spiritual currency. Even kindness was transactional. Taoist views were different, but equally problematic. Some saw modification as disrupting natural energy flow. Others saw it as transcending physical desire. Neither view acknowledged the women as individuals deserving better. Just philosophical examples. Confucianism, with its emphasis on hierarchy and order, provided justification for the practice. Women should serve. Modified women could serve without complication. The philosophy that valued harmony enabled systematic disharmony in bodies. The arrival of Christianity through missionaries complicated things. Christian theology insisted all souls were equal before God, but missionaries needed imperial favor, so they condemned the practice quietly while working within the system that perpetuated it. Islamic traders and diplomats who encountered female eunuchs compared them to their own practices. Some Islamic cultures had similar modifications. The comparison revealed that surgical control of women crossed cultural boundaries. Atrocity as universal human tendency. The modern legacy of female eunuchs is mostly absence. No memorials, no museums, no days of remembrance. Hundreds of thousands of women erased twice, first physically, then historically. Their suffering too shameful for public acknowledgement. When China opened to tourism, officials made conscious decisions about what to show. Palaces, yes. Modifications, no. Beauty, yes. The suffering that maintained it, no. Tourist money laundering atrocity into architecture. The few scholars who study female eunuchs face institutional resistance. Archives restricted. Funding denied. Publications discouraged. The topic is too sensitive, too shameful, too challenging to national narratives of civilization. Chinese feminists have occasionally tried to raise awareness about female eunuchs, to use their history as example of patriarchal violence. But the topic is too uncomfortable, even for discussions of historical oppression. Some sufferings are too large to be useful politically. The medical records that survive are often in private collections. Families that inherited them from ancestor doctors. These documents contain detailed information, but aren't accessible to researchers. Private shame keeping public knowledge hidden. Museums that have artifacts related to female eunuchs rarely display them. Bronze tubes in storage. Surgical instruments in archives. Documents in restricted sections. The physical evidence exists, but isn't shown. Truth preserved, but not presented. When these artifacts are displayed, they're mislabeled. Ancient medical devices, palace implements, dynasty-era tools, never what they actually were. Language protecting viewers from uncomfortable recognition. Euphemism as museum practice. The economics of modern silence are complex. Acknowledging female eunuchs would complicate China's historical narrative. It would require revising textbooks, changing museum displays, confronting systematic atrocity. Easier and cheaper to maintain silence. International scholars who write about female eunuchs face their own challenges. Accusations of cultural insensitivity, claims of exaggeration, demands for evidence that's deliberately restricted, the difficulty of studying what power wants forgotten. Translation issues compound the problem. Many relevant documents are in classical Chinese that few can read. Terms are euphemistic and context-dependent. Direct translation often obscures meaning. The language barrier protecting historical atrocity. The intersection with modern female genital modification is obvious but rarely discussed. Similar practices, similar justifications, similar silence. The historical connection denied to avoid uncomfortable parallels. Past atrocity divorced from present practice. But the similarities are undeniable. Surgical control of female sexuality, performed on young girls, justified by culture or religion, resulting in lifetime suffering. The techniques evolved, but the impulse remains constant. Modern medical ethics would condemn historical Chinese practices, but medical ethics is recent invention. For most of history, doctors did what power demanded, healing and harming without contradiction. Professional ethics subordinate to political reality. The doctors who performed modifications weren't marginal figures. They were respected professionals. They taught students, wrote texts, attended conferences. They saw no conflict between their medical oath and their actual practice. Or they did, but continued anyway. This raises uncomfortable questions about professional compliance with atrocity. How do healers become harmers? How does systematic cruelty become medical routine? The female eunuchs provide one answer. Gradually, systematically, with institutional support. The women who perform the examinations, often former eunuchs themselves, present another moral complexity. Victims becoming victimizers. Trauma perpetuating trauma. The cycles of harm that systems create and maintain. Some of these examination women left records. Brief mentions in administrative documents. They're described as efficient, knowledgeable, cruel. Their own suffering didn't create compassion. Sometimes suffering just creates more suffering. The guards who prevented suicide, the traders who transported girls, the accountants who calculated their value, all participated in the system. Individual responsibility diffused across institutional structure. Everyone complicit, no one responsible. This diffusion of responsibility enabled continuation across millennia. No single person felt they were the cause. Just following orders, maintaining tradition, doing their job. Atrocity accomplished through bureaucratic routine. The families whose sole daughters faced impossible choices: starvation or selling a child, death or modification. These weren't free choices. Desperation eliminating agency. But the girls still suffered regardless of economic necessity. Some families convinced themselves palace service was opportunity. Better fed as a modified slave than dead from hunger. The mathematics of poverty making atrocity seem like mercy. Self-deception as survival strategy. Other families knew exactly what would happen and sold anyway. Calculated that one daughter's suffering was worth the family's survival. Sophie's choice multiplied across centuries. Individual tragedies aggregating to historical atrocity. The girls themselves had no choice at all. Taken or sold, modified without consent, forced to serve until death, agency completely eliminated. Their bodies and lives belonging to others from the moment of acquisition. This complete lack of agency is what distinguishes female eunuchs from other forms of historical servitude. Slaves might dream of freedom. Female eunuchs' modifications made even the dream impossible. Permanent marking that transcended legal status. The recovery process, taking months or years, was its own form of ongoing trauma. Daily wound care. Repeated procedures. Constant pain management. The modification wasn't a single event, but an extended process of destruction. During recovery, girls learned their new limitations. How to manage basic functions. How to walk to minimize pain. How to hide the worst symptoms. Education in living with a destroyed body. Practical knowledge for an impractical existence. The work assignments weren't random. Younger, healthier eunuchs got harder labor. Older, weaker ones got lighter tasks. Those near death got the death quarters. A hierarchy of declining capacity. Bodies used until completely exhausted. The progression from modification to death typically took 15 to 20 years, according to various estimates. Some died quickly from complications. Others lingered for decades. But all followed the same trajectory. Modification, labor, decline, death. The death quarters represented the final stage. Warehouses for dying women. Minimal food, no medical care, weekly body removal. The economics of dying calculated precisely. Maintaining the dying just long enough to extract final value. Women in the death quarters sometimes formed their own communities, sharing resources, caring for those worse off, telling stories, creating meaning in meaninglessness. Human connection persisting despite everything. But mostly they died alone, surrounded by others, but isolated in individual suffering. Death as solitary as life had been. The final loneliness of lives defined by isolation. The disposal of bodies was efficient and anonymous. Mass cremation for economy. Ashes scattered without ceremony. No markers, no records of individuals. Death as anonymous as life had been. The rivers where ashes were scattered received thousands of female eunuchs over centuries, their remains mixing in water, flowing to the sea. The only equality they ever experienced, identical disposal after death. Modern construction projects occasionally uncover mass burial sites. Bones showing evidence of pelvic modification. Quick reburial without study. The past literally covered up to avoid confronting it. These archaeological discoveries could provide valuable information about health, diet, lifespan, conditions. But study would require acknowledgement. Easier to rebury and forget. Silence maintained through deliberate ignorance. The tourism industry around Chinese palaces generates billions annually. Visitors admire architecture and artifacts. They don't know about the modified women who maintain these spaces. Their ignorance carefully preserved by selective presentation. Tour guides are trained to avoid difficult topics. If asked about servants, they mention male eunuchs briefly. Female eunuchs are never mentioned. The script carefully written to exclude uncomfortable truth. The gift shops sell replicas of palace treasures. Silk robes, porcelain, jewelry. They don't sell replicas of bronze tubes or surgical instruments. Some artifacts are too honest for commercialization. Educational materials for students visiting palaces focus on emperors, culture, art. The human cost is minimized or ignored. Children learn about beauty without learning about the suffering that maintained it. This selective education continues the erasure. Each generation learns incomplete history. The female eunuchs fade further from memory. Soon they'll exist only in restricted archives and disputed scholarship. But forgetting enables repetition. Unexamined atrocity provides template for future harm. The female eunuchs matter not just as historical victims, but as warning about systematic dehumanization. Their story reveals how atrocity becomes routine, how institutions normalize harm, how language obscures reality, how economics justifies suffering, how culture enables cruelty, lessons relevant beyond their specific suffering. The female eunuchs also demonstrate resilience, surviving in destroyed bodies, creating connections despite isolation, maintaining humanity despite dehumanization, finding meaning in meaninglessness, persistence as resistance. Some lived for decades after modification, working, enduring, continuing, not thriving, but surviving. Their continued existence a form of rebellion against a system designed to use and discard them. They left few records, but they left traces. Scratches on walls, modified bones in burial sites, bronze tubes in museums, fragments of existence that refuse complete erasure, evidence persisting despite efforts to eliminate it. Modern DNA analysis could potentially identify some individuals, connect remains to regions of origin, provide information about their lives. But this would require acknowledging they existed as individuals worth identifying. The last living female eunuchs died within living memory. People alive today might have known them, but their stories weren't recorded. The last witnesses dying without testifying. Final erasure through silence. If there were photographs, they're hidden in family albums. If there were letters, they're in private collections. If there were diaries, they're in locked archives. The evidence exists, but isn't accessible. Truth preserved, but not public. The Chinese government's position on female eunuchs is essentially that they didn't exist in significant numbers. A minor historical practice, exaggerated by Western scholars. Official denial maintaining comfortable ignorance. But the architectural evidence doesn't lie. The medical texts are clear despite euphemism. The economic records show systematic practice. The archaeological discoveries confirm mass modification. Denial requires ignoring multiple evidence streams. International human rights organizations occasionally mention historical female eunuchs, usually in context of modern genital modification. But historical atrocity is less politically sensitive than current practice. Safer to condemn the past and confront the present. The female eunuchs deserve better than footnotes and denial. They deserve recognition as individuals who suffered real pain, who lived complete lives despite incomplete bodies, who mattered despite being told they didn't. Their stories, even reconstructed from fragments, reveal fundamental truths about power, bodies, and control, about how societies justify atrocity, about how individuals endure the unendurable, about how humanity persists in dehumanizing conditions. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, you have learned about systematic horror that lasted 3 millennia, about hundreds of thousands of women whose bodies were destroyed for others' convenience, about suffering so vast it becomes abstract. But remember, they were real. Each one felt pain as acute as you would feel it. Each one had thoughts, fears, hopes, memories. Each one was a complete person, despite an incomplete body. Their suffering wasn't abstract to them. Remember, too, that civilization and cruelty aren't opposites. The same dynasties that produced poetry and philosophy produced female eunuchs. Beauty and brutality coexisted. They always do. Comfort requires not seeing the cost. The palaces tourists photograph were maintained by mutilated women. The silk in museums was washed by damaged hands. The gardens where emperors wrote about harmony were tended by women living in constant discord between body and function. This isn't distant history. The last female eunuch died recently enough that her doctors might still be alive. The practice ended within some people's lifetimes. The past is closer than we pretend, and the impulse that created female eunuchs hasn't disappeared. The desire to control female bodies through modification continues. Different justifications, different methods, same fundamental violation. History rhyming with itself. So as you drift towards sleep in your intact body, in your world where such modifications are supposedly history, remember that forgetting enables repetition. That silence serves power. That comfortable history is incomplete history. Remember Wei, the fictional rat who represented the only reliable witness to suffering, who saw without judging, who provided companionship without conditions. Sometimes the smallest recognitions matter most. Remember the women who couldn't sleep from pain, who needed bronze tubes for basic functions, who walked in that careful shuffle that marked them forever, who lived and died in service to beauty they couldn't experience. Remember that their erasure from history is a second violence. First their bodies were destroyed, then their memories were eliminated. Double obliteration in service of comfortable forgetting. But you've heard their story now, filtered through centuries and sources, fragmented and reconstructed, but still their story. The female eunuchs of ancient China existed. They suffered. They mattered. They deserve more than they got in life or death. They deserve remembrance that honors their full humanity. They deserve recognition that their suffering was real, individual, and important. They deserve better than footnotes. As sleep approaches, let their story settle into memory. Not the graphic details, but the human truth. Thousands of women destroyed for convenience, living in pain for others' comfort, dying forgotten but real. The architecture of suffering has been demolished or repurposed. The modification rooms are storage. The death quarters are parking. The evidence is hidden or destroyed, but the truth persists in fragments. Those fragments matter. They're all that remains of hundreds of thousands of individual lives. Each scratch on stone, each bronze tube, each bone in mass burial represents someone who lived, suffered, and died. Someone who mattered. The female eunuchs can't speak for themselves. Their voices were never recorded. Their stories never told in their own words. They exist now only as reconstructions from hostile sources. But even hostile sources can't completely erase truth. So tonight, you've learned about one of history's longest systematic atrocities. 3,000 years of surgical control. hundreds of thousands of destroyed bodies, millions of years of collective suffering, numbers that numb through scale, but also individual stories. A girl sold at 12, a woman dying at 30, a rat named Wei. Small details that humanize incomprehensible suffering. Fragments that suggest complete lives lived in incomplete bodies. The story ends where it began, with you, intact and free, learning about women who are neither, with comfort built on forgotten suffering, with beauty maintained by destroyed bodies, with history sanitized for easy consumption. Close your eyes, let sleep come, but carry with you the knowledge that female eunuchs existed. They were real. They suffered. They died. They deserve remembrance. Their story is over. Yours continues. Make it matter. Don't forget. Sleep well in your intact body, and remember them. Let's return to the historical documentation, sparse and contradictory as it is. The earliest potential reference to female eunuchs appears on Shang Dynasty oracle bones, though the interpretation is disputed. The characters that some scholars read as purified palace women might mean something entirely different. Ancient Chinese is notoriously difficult to translate with certainty. By the Zhou dynasty, the evidence becomes slightly clearer, though still debated. Archaeological sites have yielded bronze implements that some identify as surgical tools for modification. Others argue they're general medical instruments or even cooking utensils. Without contemporary written explanation, we're guessing at purpose from shape alone. The spring and autumn period provides more textual evidence, though much comes from later sources claiming to quote earlier ones. The practice was apparently established enough to be mentioned in administrative documents, but these documents might be later forgeries. Chinese history is full of texts claiming ancient authority. The Warring States period supposedly saw different kingdoms developing different approaches. Some historians claim the Qi kingdom preferred partial modification, while Sichu went for complete removal. But these distinctions might be later historians imposing order on chaos. Real practices were probably less systematic than records suggest. When Qin Shi Huang unified China in 221 BCE, he allegedly standardized the procedure, along with weights, measures, and writing. But the burning of books and burying of scholars means most Qin records come from their Han successors, who had reason to exaggerate Qin brutality. History written by winners is always suspect. The Han Dynasty is where documentation improves, though still fragmentary. Palace employment records survive, some listing female eunuchs by category and function. But numbers vary wildly between sources. One document says 3,000 in the capital. Another says 800. A third says 10,000 across the empire. The truth is unknowable. You're in a different story now. Same suffering, different dynasty. It's the Tang, supposedly China's golden age. You're 13, from a merchant family in Luoyang. Your father's business failed. Debts came due. You were payment. The Tang Palace is even grander than the Han. More buildings, more servants, more everything. The modification procedures have been refined over centuries. The survival rate is supposedly higher, though that might just mean better record-keeping of deaths. You survive the procedure. Most do now. That's not mercy, just improved technique. Your assignment is to the Imperial Library. Not to read. You're not allowed education, but to maintain the scrolls. Dusting, organizing, ensuring proper storage. The scholars treat you as furniture that unfortunately moves. They discuss philosophy and poetry while you clean around them, invisible. The library contains medical texts describing what was done to you, detailed diagrams, procedural instructions, post-operative care guidelines. You can't read them, but you recognize the illustrations. Strange to see your suffering converted to educational material. Your pain as someone else's learning opportunity. Wei finds you here too. Or his descendant. Or just another rat you've decided to call Wei. The library has many rats, feeding on scroll paste and paper. This Wei is sleeker than kitchen rats, almost elegant. He watches you work with what you interpret as sympathy, but is probably just rat curiosity. The Tang Dynasty's approach to female eunuchs was supposedly more organized than previous eras. According to administrative documents, though many are copies of copies, they had standardized procedures, recovery protocols, and work assignments. Bureaucracy applied to human modification. Suffering systematized. The famous Tang poet Lai Bai wrote obliquely about palace women, though never specifically about eunuchs. His poems describe shadows serving beauty and incomplete flowers in the imperial garden. Modern scholars debate whether these are references to female eunuchs or just metaphorical. Poets rarely speak plainly about atrocity. Another Tang poet, Du Fu, was more direct, though his references are still veiled. He wrote about women who walk like winter birds and servants who cannot sing. These might be observations of female eunuchs, or they might be entirely metaphorical. Poetry resists definitive interpretation. The Tang medical texts are the most detailed that survive, though their accuracy is questioned. They describe various modification techniques, each with supposed advantages. Some doctors advocated minimal removal. Others insisted complete modification was necessary. The debates read like academic discussions, not acknowledgement of torture. One Tang doctor, Sun Sima, wrote extensively about treating complications from modification. His texts, preserved in later compilations, describe chronic infections, incontinence management, and pain relief techniques. He seems genuinely interested in reducing suffering, though he never questions the practice itself. The economics of Tang Dynasty female eunuchs are better documented than earlier periods. Palace budgets list costs for purchase, modification, maintenance, and disposal. Yes, disposal. Death was a budget item. The accounting is precise, even if the human cost is obscured. Trade routes for supplying girls to the palace were well established by the Tang. Certain merchants specialized in this traffic. They had regular suppliers, established prices, quality guarantees. The commodification of human beings refined to commercial art. Some Tang-era families bred daughters specifically for palace service. They knew the girls would be modified, but calculated that palace slavery was better than rural poverty. These families often had multi-generational contracts with traders. Selling daughters became family business. The Tang also saw the practice spread beyond the imperial palace. Wealthy merchants and regional governors began keeping modified female servants. It became a status symbol. The more female eunuchs you owned, the more powerful you appeared. Suffering as social currency. Buddhist monasteries in the Tang period sometimes accepted female eunuchs as workers. Not as nuns, they weren't considered pure enough, but as servants. The monasteries claimed this was compassionate, providing refuge. But they still required labor from damaged bodies. Compassion with conditions. Taoist temples had different policies. Some refused female eunuchs entirely, considering them unnaturally altered. Others accepted them, seeing their suffering as a path to transcendence. Religious interpretation of atrocity varied by sect and century. The An Lushan rebellion in 755 CE disrupted the palace system. During the chaos, many female eunuchs escaped or were abandoned. Most died quickly outside palace walls. They had no skills beyond palace service, no families to return to, bodies that marked them as modified. Freedom meant death for most. Those who survived the rebellion and remained in service faced new masters with different demands. Each change of power meant adaptation to new cruelties. The specific forms of suffering might change, but suffering itself remained constant. You're 25 now in this Tang story. Your body is failing faster than it did in the Han version. Maybe the Tang procedures were more damaging. Maybe it's just random biological variation. Bodies fail at different rates, even with identical trauma. The Tang Palace has a specific area for dying female eunuchs. It's more organized than the Han death quarters. Regular food delivery, weekly body removal, even basic medical care to extend useful life slightly. The Tang bureaucratized dying as they bureaucratized everything. Your Tang death is more documented than your Han one. A secretary records your number, origin, years of service, and cause of death. You become a line in a ledger that will survive in imperial archives. More lasting than your Han death, but equally anonymous. Let's shift to the Song dynasty. Different era, same fundamental practice. The Song supposedly refined the procedures further. According to medical texts that may or may not be authentic, they developed techniques that reduced immediate mortality, but increased long-term suffering. The Song Palace employed fewer female eunuchs than the Tang. Economic constraints, some historians say. Others argue it was humanitarian progress. More likely it was practical. The Song had a smaller empire, less wealth, fewer resources for maintaining massive servant populations. Song dynasty poets were more explicit about female eunuchs than their Tang predecessors. Su Shi wrote about women dismembered for service and the sorrow of incomplete bodies. His directness was unusual. Most preferred metaphor to uncomfortable truth. The Song also saw the first known protests against the practice. A group of Confucian scholars petitioned the emperor to end female modifications. They argued it violated natural order. The emperor ignored them. The scholars were exiled. Protest had consequences. Medical innovation during the Song included better tools and techniques. Steel replaced iron for blades. Herbal anesthetics were supposedly developed, though their effectiveness is doubtful. Cauterization techniques reduced bleeding. Progress in extending suffering. The Song legal code included specific regulations about female eunuchs. Who could own them, how they could be used, penalties for killing them. Yes, there were penalties, though minimal. A female eunuch's life was worth 1/10 the fine for killing a horse. You're in the Song dynasty now, but your story is becoming repetitive. Different dynasty, same modification, same suffering, same death. The details vary, but the core remains. A girl destroyed for others' convenience. A lifetime of pain. A death unmourned. The Mongol conquest brought the Yuan dynasty and new approaches to female eunuchs. The Mongols initially saw the practice as evidence of Chinese weakness. Real warriors didn't need to destroy women to control them. But within a generation, they adopted it enthusiastically. Marco Polo's account of the Yuan court mentions female eunuchs, though his description is vague. He refers to women altered in the Chinese manner, serving in Kublai Khan's palace. His Venetian readers probably didn't understand the reference, or chose not to. The Mongols allegedly preferred more extreme modifications than the Chinese. They wanted servants completely desexualized, incapable of any pleasure or normal function. Whether this is true or Chinese propaganda about their conquerors is unknown. History and propaganda are often indistinguishable. Yuan dynasty records, written in Mongolian and Chinese, provide different numbers for female eunuchs. The Mongolian sources claim fewer. The Chinese sources claim more. Each side had reasons to lie. Truth exists somewhere between their lies. The Yuan period saw female eunuchs used in new ways. Some were sent as gifts between Mongol nobles. Others were used as diplomatic presents to foreign courts. The commodification expanded beyond domestic service to international relations. The Ming Dynasty brought Chinese rule back and industrialized the practice. The Forbidden City, built during the Ming, included purpose-built facilities for modification and recovery. Architecture designed around the expectation of mass mutilation. Ming records are extensive but suspect. The dynasty lasted nearly 300 years, with different emperors having different policies. Some periods saw thousands of modifications annually. Others saw restrictions. The variation makes generalization difficult. The Ming medical texts are the most detailed that survive. They describe procedures with clinical precision that would be called torture manuals today. Step-by-step instructions for destroying female bodies while keeping them functional enough to work. One Ming doctor, Li Shizhen, included female eunuch treatment in his comprehensive medical text. He describes complications and treatments matter-of-factly. No moral judgment, just medical observation. Professional detachment from human suffering. The Ming also saw the practice spread to Korea and Vietnam. Chinese cultural influence included exporting atrocity. Each culture adapted the practice to their needs, but the core remained: surgical control of female bodies. The economics of Ming Dynasty female eunuchs were calculated precisely. Purchase price, modification cost, expected years of service, return on investment, spreadsheets of suffering. The bureaucracy of bondage refined to mathematical precision. Ming-era traders developed sophisticated networks for acquiring girls. They knew which regions had drought, where families were desperate, which officials could be bribed. Disaster capitalism before the term existed. Some Ming emperors supposedly had favorites among their female eunuchs. Not romantic or sexual, that was impossible after modification, but particular servants they trusted or valued for specific skills. Even this minimal recognition was rare. The Wanli Emperor, who ruled for 48 years, allegedly employed 8,000 female eunuchs at the height of his reign. This number comes from a single source and might be exaggerated, but even half that number represents massive suffering. The Ming saw the first Western medical observations of female eunuchs. Jesuit missionaries with medical training examined modified women and wrote detailed reports to Rome. These reports, preserved in Vatican archives, provide outside perspective on the practice. Father Matteo Ricci's accounts are particularly valuable, though filtered through his own biases. He describes the procedures, the suffering, the daily reality of modified women. His horror is evident even in clinical Latin. Some suffering transcends language barriers. Let's talk about the daily reality across dynasties. Certain aspects remained constant regardless of era. The careful walk, the chronic pain, the constant management of bodies that didn't work properly. These universals transcended dynastic change. The social isolation was consistent too. Female eunuchs were neither women nor men, neither whole nor acceptably incomplete. They existed in a social void, recognized only as units of labor. This isolation might have been worse than the physical suffering. The language for describing female eunuchs evolved, but remained euphemistic. Each dynasty had its terms, all avoiding direct acknowledgement of what was done. Language protecting the powerful from confronting their cruelty. The few personal accounts that might be from female eunuchs themselves, though authentication is impossible, describe profound loneliness. Physical pain was constant, but bearable. Social isolation was devastating. Humans need recognition as humans. They were denied even that. The relationship between female eunuchs across generations was complex. Older women taught younger ones survival skills, but trauma doesn't always create solidarity. Sometimes it creates cycles of cruelty. Hurt people, even when they share hurt. The male eunuch's attitude toward female ones varied by individual and era. Some saw them as fellow sufferers deserving solidarity. Others saw them as inferior, damaged beyond even male castration. Hierarchies of harm dividing the harmed. Palace women who weren't modified lived in fear of it as punishment. This fear shaped behavior, ensured compliance. The threat of modification was almost as powerful as modification itself. Terror as social control. Children raised in palaces grew up seeing female eunuchs as normal. This normalization ensured continuation across generations, each generation accepting what the previous one established. Atrocity becoming tradition through repetition. The arrival of photography in the late Qing period could have documented female eunuchs visually, but they were deliberately excluded from photographs. Their existence was too shameful for visual record. Even as everything else was photographed, they remained invisible. The few photographs that might show female eunuchs are disputed. Elderly women with distinctive postures in 1920s Beijing. Are they female eunuchs or just elderly women with arthritis? Without documentation, we can't know. Visual evidence as uncertain as textual. The Qing dynasty, China's last, continued the practice until the end. The last emperor, Pui, was served by female eunuchs until his expulsion in 1924. He wrote about them briefly in his autobiography, noting their presence without describing their condition. The end of imperial China meant the end of systematic palace modification. But the women already modified didn't suddenly heal. They lived on, carrying their damage into the Republican era, the Communist Revolution, the modern age. Some found work as servants in wealthy households. Others became beggars. A few were taken in by Buddhist temples. Most simply disappeared into urban poverty, dying quietly as they had lived. Freedom didn't mean healing. The Communist Revolution promised to end all feudal practices. Female eunuchs were declared victims of imperial oppression. But declaring someone a victim doesn't undo their victimization. The women remained damaged, poor, isolated. During the Cultural Revolution, some female eunuchs were persecuted as remnants of the old system. Their suffering under imperialism didn't protect them from suffering under communism. Victims blamed for surviving their victimization. The last definite female eunuch, though there might have been others, died in the 1990s. She never spoke publicly about her experience. Her death was noted in a medical journal as the end of a historical phenomenon. Even in death, she was phenomenon, not person. Modern China doesn't acknowledge female eunuchs in education or museums. They're erased from popular history. The Forbidden City tour guides don't mention them. The modification rooms are storage. The death quarters demolished. Physical erasure complementing historical erasure. When female eunuchs are mentioned in Chinese academic work, it's always briefly and clinically. Statistical mentions in discussions of palace administration, never centered as subjects worthy of study. Their suffering footnoted even in scholarship. Western scholarship on female eunuchs faces challenges. Limited sources, translation difficulties, cultural sensitivities. Some argue the practice is exaggerated. Others insist it's underestimated. Without access to Chinese archives, certainty is impossible. The destruction of records during various upheavals means we'll never know the full extent. How many women were modified? How many died? How many suffered for how long? The numbers are estimates built on fragments, built on assumptions. But even conservative estimates represent massive suffering. Tens of thousands of women over 3 millennia, each one experiencing individual pain within systematic atrocity. Scale doesn't diminish individual suffering. It multiplies it. Let's return to Wei one more time. The fictional rat who represented the only consistent relationship in a female eunuch's life. Real or imagined, Wei mattered because he witnessed without judging. In a life of dehumanization, even a rat's recognition had value. The real animals in palaces probably did provide comfort to female eunuchs. Cats, birds, even insects. Creatures that didn't care about modification, didn't recoil from damage. Animal companionship, when human companionship was impossible. These relationships with animals appear occasionally in historical records. Punishments for female eunuchs keeping pets. Regulations against feeding palace animals. Rules trying to prevent the only emotional connections available to modified women. But the women kept forming these connections. Humans need attachment, even damaged humans, even to rats. The persistence of care and conditions designed to eliminate it. Small rebellions of emotion in systems of control.